As most of you probably know by now, I've spent a lot of time on this channel criticizing SLS and slamming on its incredible expense, its lack of reusability, its lack of innovation, all sorts of things that really point to the fact that this is not the heavy lift rocket for the future. This is not the rocket that should be powering Artemis. However, regardless of what I may think or what anybody else may think, or indeed what may be happening in Boca Chica right now, SLS is about to proceed with its wet rehearsal again. And we need to ask ourselves, what happens if things go well? What happens if everything goes flawlessly this time and SLS is ready for its maiden launch in August? Just a few years ago, when Jim Bridenstine wrote his introduction or his foreword to the Artemis plan, NASA's overview to what they really were looking to accomplish, it all looked very positive, very exciting. Quote, "We will return to the moon robotically beginning next year, send astronauts to the surface within 4 years, and build a long-term presence on the moon by the end of the decade. I am proud to share NASA's Artemis plan. This is how we will go to the moon once again, and how we will use the moon as the stepping stone for our next greatest step, human exploration of Mars. We are going, and we go together." Wow, that sounds very optimistic, very positive. Anybody who gets excited about space should really like the Artemis plan. So what really is it? Let's assume that everything goes perfectly with SLS. What is Artemis really going to bring to the future of human exploration of the solar system? Well, unfortunately, as ambitious as Artemis may look, and as optimistic as the whole thing may sound, it's actually a lot less ambitious than the Apollo program, at least in terms of cadence of launches. And if we're looking to establish a permanent presence on the moon, this isn't the plan that's going to do it. And if Starship were to step in, yeah, that could change everything, but I've got some serious doubts as to whether or not NASA would really fully embrace this technology and change Artemis from what they originally intended. Why do I believe all of this? Well, we're going to check all of that out in just a moment. Okay, for just a moment, I'm going to pretend that I just had a frontal lobotomy, and I'm going to talk about the assets of SLS, all of its high points, and it does indeed have quite a few of them. Yeah, it really does. It's kind of hard to understand or accept that given all of the ineptitude and all the problems that we've faced thus far in the development of this rocket, but when it's completed, and assuming that it actually functions the way it's supposed to, and that is a big if, it's going to be able to accomplish what no other rocket on the planet can. No other rocket in human history, aside from the Saturn V perhaps, will be able to do what SLS can do, and that is to fling a huge amount of payload all the way out to translunar injection orbit without any refueling. Even the Block 1, which is really sort of an interim rocket, the first stage in what's supposed to be a much more ambitious rocket in the long run, can send all the way 27 metric tons, that is, all the way out to TLI. And it's going to get a lot more ambitious as SLS gets more powerful. We're going to have more powerful solid rocket boosters, therefore allowing the rocket to carry even more payload. We're talking 38 metric tons on the Block 1B 1B, and that's on the Crew Plus cargo version, and the SLS Block 1B cargo will be able to carry 42 tons. What that means is you're looking at an extra 15 tons worth of payload on the SLS Block 1B, and it gets even more powerful. The Block 2 Crew is capable of carrying 43 metric tons, so that means we're talking what the SLS is originally supposed to carry plus an additional 16 tons worth of cargo, all in one mission without any refueling. Pretty damned impressive. And then the Block 2 cargo carries 46 metric tons all the way out to TLI. Yes, crazy expensive. Yes, not reusable. All of these things make it a lot more expensive and a lot more wasteful than Starship, but at the same time, without a refueling infrastructure, it's theoretically a lot more simple. But of course, that isn't the reality, as we've noticed as of late. Now, there are other modifications that will also add to the payload capability of the SLS in the future, and the most significant of these, of course, is the Exploration Upper Stage, adding 4 RL-10 engines instead of 1, which really provides a lot of extra boost once you get the cargo all the way out to LEO. Once you're in LEO, you actually don't need a tremendous amount of thrust to get a lot further from that, as long as you're not pushing a great deal of payload. And unlike Starship, the upper stage of SLS is not constructed out of heavy stainless steel, does not weigh 100 metric tons, and therefore those 4 little RL-10 engines, which aren't nearly as powerful as 4 Raptors, are still able to push a tremendous amount of cargo all the way out to the moon. As I said before, we're talking nearly 50 metric tons, plus a very big fairing, almost 1,000 cubic meters, nearly as big as Starship's fairing. All very impressive without any refueling, and all crazy expensive. But what's the point I'm trying to make? That in some cases, SLS may have an advantage over Starship. If you need to send out a lot of payload or crew without having to mess around with refueling at all, you can do it with SLS a lot easier than you can with Starship. That being said, however, SLS obviously isn't demonstrating that it's very reliable for much of anything, but assuming that that changes, SLS may prove to be an important part of the future of Artemis. That is to say, if we properly fund it. So let's talk a little bit about what this program is really going to look like if SLS turns out to be more successful than it's looking right now. Artemis 1 is actually going to be a pretty interesting mission, assuming that it actually gets off the ground. It's going to be more than just orbiting the moon once and coming back. Instead, the Orion spacecraft will enter Earth orbit while still attached to the ICPS, while they perform systems checks and solar panel adjustments, etc., before the ICPS burns it towards translunar injection. Then the ICPS separates, and the Orion spacecraft takes over with its own thrusters in order to get it into the proper outbound trajectory, and there's probably going to need some correction burns and other things are going to be required in order to get it into the proper orbit. After that, it performs what's called the outbound powered flyby, or the OPF, 62 miles away from the moon, and while it's doing this, it's also going to deploy 10 CubeSats to get more bang for your buck, which we could really use with SLS, including things like the Lunar Ice Cube, which is designed to search for water and other resources on the moon, the NEA Scout, which is used for exploring asteroids. Actually, it's a CubeSat developed by NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center that will perform a flyby of a small asteroid and collect observational data on its environment. Also, something called the Luna H-Map, or the Lunar Polar Hydrogen Mapper, developed by Arizona State University, that will map water deposits on the lunar surface, allowing NASA to access the distribution of this vital resource on the moon. A hell of a lot of really interesting payloads involved with this mission, and we could certainly use it, as I said, given the amount of money we're spending on it. And by the way, future Artemis missions will be able to carry up to 17 CubeSats with every mission on top of the primary mission, so that's a little helpful, although not tremendously. Then Orion will enter what's called a distant retrograde orbit for the next 6 to 23 days. During that time, it will perform orbital maintenance burns and solar panel adjustments, essentially putting Orion through its paces, traveling 38,000 miles from the surface of the moon. If there were human beings aboard this mission, they would travel further away from the Earth than any human in history. After that, it will depart its orbit and make its way back to Earth, performing what's called a return power flyby in order to break orbit and return to Earth. The entire mission should take about 3 weeks, and the total distance traveled will be 1.3 million miles. Also, the re-entry speed is going to be very fast, about 11 kilometers per second, which is significantly hotter than anything Orion has experienced before, simply because when it performed its first test in 2014, it was only re-entering from low Earth orbit. So this will definitely be putting this spacecraft through its paces. Not only that, the length of the mission, this 3-week mission, is to also test the resiliency of the life support system, because after all, it's going to have to support at least 2 astronauts for a much longer period of time than any Apollo mission did. So this mission is going to determine a great deal about the future viability of SLS and Orion. So if everything goes perfectly well, Artemis 2 is essentially going to be a repeat of Artemis 1, except it's going to have astronauts on board. Or if we are very lucky, and I hope we are, it's actually going to be a dress rehearsal for Artemis 3, complete with a docking with the Lunar Gateway. It's entirely possible that we're going to have the first 2 components of the Gateway in place and ready by the time Artemis 2 comes around. SpaceX, with an extended fairing on Falcon Heavy, will be delivering both the power and propulsion element for Gateway, being produced by Maxar. By the way, that's complete with an ion engine that's capable of being refueled, and also the habitation and logistics outpost, which is little more than a Cygnus resupply ship put out by Northrop Grumman, complete with a life support system, and that's about it. So you're not talking about much of a space station here. You're talking about a couple of astronauts flying around the moon in a tin can. And by the way, the Orion's life support system will also be providing habitable living space and additional life support for the station while it's docked. It's designed to do that. So not too bad of a plan if it actually goes through, and then we'll move on to Artemis 3, which will be again a repeat of Artemis 2, except this time we're going to have Lunar Starship providing transportation to the surface, and Lunar Starship is going to require a hell of a lot of logistics in order to make it work. We're talking a dozen or so refueling missions, or at least 10 or so, before it's capable of traveling all the way to the Gateway, docking with it, making a descent to the lunar surface, hanging out there for a little while, returning to the Gateway, and then going all the way back to low Earth orbit in order to get refueled. Now, some people are saying that Starship will be able to carry 200 tons worth of propellant and oxidizer rather than 100 tons. If that's the case, then maybe 5 or 6 refueling missions will do the job. But until I've got evidence that shows that Starship now has a payload capability of 200 tons, we're looking at a hell of a lot of refueling missions for Lunar Starship before it can carry out its part of the job. This is one of the reasons why SLS has certain advantages. The logistical complications of all of those refueling missions, combined with possible scrubs and other issues, can really draw out the length of a mission and also cause you to miss launch windows, that sort of thing. SLS isn't going to have those sorts of problems, assuming that it proves to be a reliable rocket in the future, a lot better than it is right now. That's a big assumption. Now, Starship can do the entire job, but we'll talk about that in a second. Assuming everything goes well with Artemis 3, then SLS will be changing. It will be graduating up to the Block 1B in order to carry the most important component of the Lunar Gateway out to the station, and that is the IHAB module, a very large habitation module for larger crews of astronauts. At least 4 astronauts will be traveling on future missions to the moon, and the Halo plus the Orion is simply not enough space for sustained operations in lunar orbit. And as I mentioned in a previous video, this is one thing that really sucks about the Artemis mission and the entire plan is the fact that Artemis 4 is not going to be carrying any astronauts at all. Falcon Heavy and all of the other commercial rockets that are currently planned are not capable of carrying this very large module out to the Lunar Gateway, and we're going to need this module in order to carry out future manned missions, which means we're going to have a very lengthy period of time between Artemis 3 and Artemis 5 when there will be nobody going to the moon whatsoever. Now, maybe Starship can carry out this mission instead, assuming that they can get the refueling process quick and efficient. If they do that, then maybe Artemis 4 can actually be Artemis 5, which would be a very positive thing indeed. In addition to the IHAB module, the ESA will also be providing the European system providing refueling infrastructure and telecommunications module, or the Esprit, to the Lunar Gateway, and that module will be arriving with the Artemis 5 mission, which will be the first mission that will include 4 human beings with an intention of landing them on the surface. And it is my hope that by this time, 2027 at the earliest, by the way, that we're going to have some alternatives as far as landing craft are concerned. I believe that Lunar Starship is the future for developing large colonies and large bases on the moon, but I think it should be used for refueling purposes for smaller landing craft, such as this one from Dynetics, which is fully reusable and could make several trips to the lunar surface if it had a fuel tank in orbit provided by Lunar Starship. This would require fewer refueling missions for Lunar Starship, since it wouldn't have to go all the way to the moon, and it would also allow the crew members to travel to the moon's surface multiple times, 3 or 4 times at least, with what Starship is capable of carrying. That being the case, though, Artemis 5 is only designed with a 30-day mission. So is Artemis 6 in 2028 and Artemis 7 in 2029. It's only when we get to Artemis 8 in 2030 that we start having 60-day missions for our crews. And by the way, it's only 1 mission per year, as most of us are aware at this point. It's just because of the expense of SLS. Now, that is not frequent enough, and that is not going to the moon to stay. We're talking about going to the moon 1 month out of 12 every year until 2030, when we'll be able to go there 2 months out of 12, which means the Lunar Gateway is going to be unoccupied the vast majority of the time. That, in my opinion, is a recipe for failure. Instead, we need to have a minimum of 2 missions per year going to the moon, and if that requires an additional $2 to $4 billion for another SLS, then so be it. That is a minor increase in budget compared to the budgets of so many different government agencies. Without 2 missions to the moon per year, this whole damn thing is going to fail. In addition, I think NASA should start looking at much longer duration missions as early as possible, not just 30 days or 60 days, but 3 to 6 months, just like we do with the ISS. As long as we can get the Lunar Gateway with enough radiation protection in order to minimize the effect of cosmic rays, that's when we should really be doing dress rehearsals for missions to Mars. And that's what the Gateway is intended to provide, along with a base camp for operations on the moon. Now, what you're looking at right now is the HTV-X, which is a Japanese resupply ship ship capable of carrying over 4 tons worth of pressurized cargo and 1.75 additional tons worth of unpressurized cargo all the way to the Lunar Gateway along with the ISS. Now, this vessel, along with the Dragon resupply ship that's designed specifically for lunar resupply on the Falcon Heavy and other vehicles, for example, the Shooting Star off of Sierra Space, all of those vehicles are capable of providing the necessary supplies and additional life support to sustain longer duration missions, which I think we're definitely going to need if we really want to go to the moon to stay. It's going to be a lot harder to cancel a mission like that if you always have astronauts at least in orbit around the moon, as opposed to a space station that's unoccupied the vast majority of the time. Plus, you can get a hell of a lot more accomplished. In addition to that, NASA intends to establish a base camp on the moon. You're seeing an example of what they might have in mind for that, an inflatable module. By the way, I got this footage when I made my journey to Virginia and checked out the Virginia Aerospace Museum. Very, very interesting stuff there. And by the way, linked in the description and also linked right here is a video of my tour of this facility. Lots of interesting stuff, including this intriguing lunar module. And by the way, footage like this would not be possible without you guys' generous support. So please check out the description. There's lots of new merchandise that I'm introducing right now, along with benefits for those who want to support me through Patreon. Okay, enough self-promotion, let's move on. In addition to inflatable bases, NASA also intends to deploy fission power to the surface of the moon, and that's going to be an absolute necessity because solar power simply isn't going to work during the long lunar night, and there are no sources of methane or any way to manufacture large sources of methane on the lunar surface in case you wanted power cells of some kind. So nuclear power is going to be an absolute essential in order to provide life support and everything else that these bases are going to require. Now, once you have a nuclear power plant on the surface of the moon, you have the ability to sustain astronauts there indefinitely. So once again, why the damn 30 to 60 day durations? Instead, we should have 2 SLS missions per year, each of them 6 months. I really think as long as we can deal with the radiation protection issues, this is something that we should be doing, because any journeys to Mars are going to take 6 months as well and be exposed to the same radiation and cosmic rays. And on top of that, you're also going to have lunar rovers like this one being provided by the Japanese Space Agency. So we have a great deal of international cooperation to make Artemis successful. Really, the only extremely expensive and inefficient part of this plan is SLS, and we can absorb the cost of SLS as long as we have a lot of other commercial options providing the necessary equipment, supplies, bases, nuclear power plants, whatever you need. As long as all of that is provided by far less expensive commercial rockets, then all SLS has to do is deliver the crews. In my opinion, that is a winning formula, assuming that SLS comes through. But let's say it doesn't. What if it's unsuccessful? Then what? Well, Starship can do the entire job, as I said before. But there are a number of drawbacks. First of all, NASA is never going to accept a vessel that doesn't have an effective abort system to carry astronauts up to space, which means you're going to need Falcon 9 to carry Crew Dragon up to orbit and have Falcon 9 dock with the Lunar Starship in order to unload its precious cargo onto Lunar Starship for the journey to the moon. And then the process will need to be reversed, of course, when Lunar Starship returns. It adds additional complexity, but it's certainly doable. But here's another problem. The current Lunar Starship design is for a landing ship, not for a ship designed to provide supplies and life support for the entire journey. Certainly Starship is capable of this, but right now I don't think SpaceX is designing a ship that has the necessary life support to sustain an entire mission of 30 or 60 days. Instead, Orion is designed to do that. That could be a drawback for using Lunar Starship for the entire mission. Certainly the life support system could be redesigned to accommodate this, but that's going to take time and that's going to take money, and all of that after SLS has suffered an ignominious failure. Is Congress going to fund a brand new rocket to take astronauts to the moon when NASA has experienced such a catastrophe in the past? I have a feeling that they won't. I am deeply concerned that if SLS fails, Starship isn't going to get the opportunity to do the entire job itself. I think it eventually will, but only after NASA establishes a permanent human presence on the moon, and that's going to require SLS to be a success. I am deeply worried that if the whole job falls on Starship, Congress isn't going to fund it, and I'm not sure whether or not Elon Musk is going to put all of his own money behind Artemis when he's looking at going to Mars. It's frustrating. I mean, Starship is obviously the rocket for the job, but right now we're stuck with a flawed plan and a flawed rocket, and if we cancel it, the whole program is probably going to be in jeopardy, if not certainly doomed to cancellation, which means we have to go forward with what we have. SLS needs to be successful, at least in the short run, until we can get established on the moon and Starship gets a chance to prove itself. Are all of those things going to come together? Well, I really think some modifications need to be made, not only to SLS, but with the Artemis plan in general. It needs to be more ambitious, something like the Apollo missions of old, where we had a cadence of incredible numbers of Saturn V launches, one after another every year, until we finally gave up on it. But that was the cadence that we needed at the time in order to visit the moon frequently with the goal of establishing a permanent presence. We didn't do it, but if we want to do it now, then we absolutely need to follow their example. Smash that like, hit that subscribe, and until we actually do have a viable plan to return to the moon, this time to stay, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.